Welcome you to this discussion, which is fancily titled Geneva versus Algorithms, Redefining Laws of War and Peace. I'm Hussein Haqqani. I am a diplomat in residence and senior research fellow at the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy. I also served as Pakistan's ambassador to the United States previously. We have a stellar panel today to discuss the subject. And instead of going through the introductions of everybody, what I plan to do is to save time by inviting each one to give their first thoughts on the subject. My own view to begin the discussion is that there was a time when conflict and combat meant that people looked each other in the eye while fighting. That has changed over the centuries, and now we are moving into an era in which people can actually engage in combat without actually even having anything to do with the enemy physically. What does that mean for the laws of war? For example, there was a time when you could actually, a combatant could drop his weapons, surrender, and therefore be taken prisoner of war and be protected. That option is not available. Similarly, the distinction between civilian and combatant is much less when you are using autonomous weapons rather than having a human element, a human being. Even in the early days of drone warfare, when the drones were being operated by people, they could actually see and probably try and make a guess. They made a lot of mistakes. In Iraq, in Afghanistan, the Americans ended up dropping bombs on wedding parties because the people were carrying guns. Because the guys operating the drones did not know, they were sitting in Nevada actually, they had no idea that in some places people carry guns and fire in the air at weddings, and they ended up wiping entire wedding parties. But now, with the possibility of totally autonomous weapons, no human element, an algorithm deciding where the enemy is, who the enemy is, and how to eliminate them, there are enormous possibilities of destruction. Human beings have made laws about regulating biological warfare, banning chemical warfare, even trying to figure out a way of stopping nuclear proliferation. What are we doing about autonomous weapons and the possibility of an AI-driven war? So we have speakers with various backgrounds, and I'm going to ask everyone to give their initial thoughts one by one. The first, on my right, is Ambassador Laszlo Molnar, who has been Ambassador of Hungary to the United Nations and therefore has tremendous experience of the UN. So why don't you, Laszlo, start with what do you think is the UN's role in this? Is there anything already happening? And where do you see this going? Short comments to get the discussion rolling. And then, of course, all of you know the exercise. You are going to put down questions, which I will read from here without interpreting or interfering with your questions.
Thank you, Hussein. Thank you, Hussein. So I was asked to talk about my UN experience. I do not want to be an apologist, neither want to pretend as if I were an apologist for the United Nations. But as I was invited to this forum as the former permanent representative of my country to the UN, it is natural that I do share my insight about my UN experience in general. And in addition to that, I would like to share with you some most recent experience. I was one of those who were involved in the peace and security deep dive of the so-called high-level advisory board on artificial intelligence, which was established by the Secretary General of the UN. The board was appointed in October in 2023 to undertake analysis and advance recommendations for the international governance of AI. We had a couple of sessions in this deep dive, for example, on malicious uses of AI by states and non-state actors during peacetime as a threat to international peace and security. And also another one, the last one, was on AI as a new arms race. And in addition to that, I would also like to share with you, for a very special reason, a most recent experience as well as the new co-founder of the so-called Foundation for the International Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities. This particular foundation was registered in Budapest, the capital of my country, in 2011, and I took over this role of founder last year. We have been involved in identifying AI-related risks in conflict prevention since 2021. We have released and published several papers, publications on the rise of AI from the perspectives of mass atrocities and genocide, and on related policies. And we came up with recommendations for international and regional organizations. Now, the special reason why I'm mentioning this, certainly I would like to create some kind of recognition for this particular foundation and support, but it's not the major point here. The major point is that all of those who were writing these publications on the rise of AI from the perspectives of mass atrocities were our interns. Very, very young people. And yesterday evening we were discussing different generations here, and I can tell you that all of those who wrote these papers, what we are proud of, are basically members of Gen Z. Gen Z, which means that they were born between 1977 and 2012. And we were trying to figure out what the next generation is going to be. And I just heard at the plenary Mr. Abdullah Abu Sheikh, who is the founder of Astrotech, that he referred to this as the AI native generation. So while the ones what I was talking about, the digital natives, now we have the AI natives who are even younger than Gen Z. So all my thoughts are about what role they should play. And actually, I don't know whether you heard this morning, but there were some news related to some upheavals, some strikes and demonstrations in the capital of Nepal, in Kathmandu, where unfortunately there were already 13 people who were deceased. These are members of the Gen Z. They even call themselves the Gen Z movement. And they were demanding actually free access to social media, etc. So I will get back to this point later because my recommendations relate to that, but I stop at this point.
Thank you. Our next speaker would be, or participant would be Martin Kobler, who has been Germany's ambassador to Egypt, Iraq, Pakistan, has a long experience in diplomacy. And Martin, your early thoughts. We already heard about Gen Z and its commitment to modern technology and to AI. But the question is, are they thinking about the implications of how combat, conflict, destruction will feature in this new world that is emerging, in which people will have perhaps a lot less personal interaction than they did in the age of the chivalrous knights who actually fought one another straight and knew what the consequence of hurting or killing someone was.
No, thank you very much. Thrilled to be here, and thank you very much for this esteemed panel here. The topic of the meeting is Geneva versus algorithms. So let me a little bit go back to Geneva and international humanitarian law. And it's a very long way from the Battle of Solferino in the 19th century, in 1859, something like that, and the 4 Geneva Conventions, who were a result of the Second World War, and the additional protocols, who were a result in 1977 of what happened in the meantime. So when preparing for this, it came to my mind that the conventions were always too late. They were always too late. The Second World War was happening, then the Geneva Conventions came, the decolonization wars were happening, the guerrilla warfare, and then the international community thought, oh, we have to react. And then the protection of civilians, additional protocol number 1, and the transparency rules were done under the guidance of the ICRC and the Swiss government. So Switzerland played quite a role here. So when talking about artificial intelligence, my wish would be that we are not too late now, as we were in 49 and 1977. But we heard it on the main panel also, that governments, they react in a belated way. Now, but when we are looking at the scope that humans are taken out of a decision-making process, but the systems are still called DSS, Decision Support Systems. Now, and here in particular in Abu Dhabi, we think of the Middle East, we think of the warfare in Gaza. There are reactions in split seconds. I'm going back to two kind of researchers, Israeli researchers, who scrutinized the warfare in Gaza now. They said in former times, 20 analysts took 300 days to identify 50 targets. Now it is 100 per day with the assistance of Gospel, Lavender, or this other program the Israelis have, Where is Daddy, to identify senior targets in Gaza. Now, a target analyst nowadays has 20 seconds to decide whether he pushes the button or not, and this is just not enough. Now, what consequences should be drawn? And here speaks the former lawyer. I think we have to go back to the United Nations, to the ICRC, to others, in order, and this would my point of discussion be here, I would like to throw on the table to have a 4th additional protocol. A 4th additional protocol just spelling out the dangers we have nowadays in terms of taking humans out, and also discussing ideas of the bans. Should we really ban fully autonomous weapons? Now, I think nobody is really prepared to decide on it now, but I think the ban on the laws, the lethal autonomous warfare systems, this has to be done. And the second main point, and I come back to other points later, is the human element and the accountability question. There should never be a justification that somebody who is accountable for war crimes and this kind of warfare to say, no, the machine did it. So we have to find a legal way to preserve the human or state responsibility in artificial intelligence warfare. The machine did it should never be a justification when it comes to criminal or state responsibility.
Well, Vladimir Radunovich, a director of cybersecurity and e-diplomacy at the Diploma Foundation in Switzerland. You are closest to Geneva amongst the participants of this group. You may also be closest to the subject of autonomous weapons and what is to be done about them. Is there some progress being made about additional protocols? And secondly, isn't it ironic that they have used the euphemism for lethal autonomous warfare systems as laws, even though they are subject to no laws? And doesn't that show the intention of at least some powers not to be subjected to laws? Because human beings always try to, George Orwell in 1984, his book 1984 writes that. You always want to switch things. You always use euphemisms when you want to avoid the main subject. So are there global powers that are not interested in laws being applicable to laws?
No, we raised so many interesting bits so far. Thank you for the invitation. Well, there are some good news indeed. If we look at what's happening in the, let's say, United Nations, there have been a couple of progresses which are notable. The first one, probably the major one, is the group of governmental experts on lethal autonomous weapons, or laws, as you mentioned, which is working under the Convention on Certain Commercial Weapons. So that's, let's say, closest to Geneva. It has been operational for years already, and it's been struggling with a couple of things, including the very definition of laws. What do we mean by laws? What do we mean by autonomous systems? And there is a sort of a consensus, sort of, not final, that when we talk about autonomous, we mean able to decide and act on targets without human. Now that's back to what Ambassador Martin mentioned. The key question is, where do we put human? Can we make sure that human is in the loop deciding, or at least on the loop being able to press the button, the red button, and say stop, which, as you mentioned, is quite hard now if the human has 20 seconds to decide. But that's one of the major things. Now, the good news is the Secretary General is supposed to come back with a report on the implications of artificial intelligence in military dimension this autumn. So we hopefully will see that during the General Assembly. And that's the result of another good news, which was the resolution in General Assembly last year, which actually was specifically on the military AI and military use. And then we also have, and that's very important, it's not just, as you mentioned, militaries or AI is not just about weapon itself. It's also about the peacemaking, it's about mediation, it's about decision-making, and then it's about human rights. So we come back to Geneva, and driving us back to Geneva from New York maybe, we have the UN Human Rights Council, which has brought as well the resolution on the implications of AI in military domain on human rights and civilians. And again, the UN Human Rights Council is supposed to come back with a report this autumn. So it's going to be warm autumn. But in Geneva, we have the ICRC, as we mentioned. We also have the ITU and ISO, the standardization making bodies, because ultimately I can come back later to the technological part, unpacking the system. There is so much which is out of the scope of the defense and military context in a way. And then you have a lot of multi-stakeholder environments like the Geneva Dialogue and others, which I can refer later on.
Thank you. Dr. Rashid Almansoori, Director of RegLab, at the General Secretariat of the Cabinet of the United Arab Emirates. You are in a way doing what Martin said, which is that governments have started thinking about the future, and the UAE is one of those governments that is trying to think farther than many others. But there are others who are far behind in the thinking process. Will we be able to get there? And what are your initial thoughts on the subject?
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. It's an honor to be here with such an esteemed panel. I have a few thoughts on just going back before talking about technology and testing and all that. We're talking about elements in decision making that are very difficult to teach and to interpret when it comes to AI. So, we have a lot of principles, but I'm going through 4 right now. So, principle is distinction. How can AI make sure that there's no misidentification? And how can we test for that, right? So it depends on the data that we train the algorithm on. Second is proportionality. How can we go about and make sure that whatever action is proportionate and that it doesn't actually lead to more harm than not? On this particular point, I think AI may have an advantage rather than a disadvantage if done properly. Right? We've seen a lot of human error in wars. So we're not talking about, wars or mistakes that didn't happen or intentional acts that were later classified as mistakes. So AI may assist in that and assist in the decision-making process if we have the right precautions, which is another important element, making sure that the log is there, making sure how the decision came about. And the fourth, and I think the ambassador touched upon it, is accountability. There's a lot of blurred responsibilities. And my sort of initial thought my background as a psychologist is I'm afraid of this pressing the button scenario. There was a famous study by Stanley Milgram right after the World War, and it talked about precisely how dehumanizing and pushing people away from the decision making actually makes it easier. So you're not actually hitting, you're just confirming. So there's this confirmation bias that happens. And people would tend to go about pressing, okay, let's do it, rather than not do it, because they rely too much on the AI. So this is where now the point comes in: how can we make sure that governments are in place, putting testing mechanisms in place, making sure that technology is ready. But this cannot be done in isolation. So you're correct, the UAE is moving towards this, and it helps with a lot of things. So autonomous vehicles, how can we attest blame on an autonomous vehicle? Is it the manufacturer, is it the driver, etc.? But these are small scale, maybe country specific. But when we talk about warfare, it has to be an international collaboration. We have to make sure that everyone is on the table, that we agree to rules. And this is where I agree with the Mr. Ambassador, is make sure that there is another convention for us to actually be, this time, hopefully proactive and not work on something ad hoc. Because once we get there, it will be very difficult to stop.
Now, for hopefully a different perspective, a engineering technology perspective, Dr. George Salter. He's at the Department of Science, Technology, Engineering and Public Policy at University College London. George, what are your initial thoughts? The diplomats are emphasizing the need for global consensus. And there's a discussion about the need for some kind of structure to all of this. The technology usually moves much faster. And in my experience, people who are in the technology field are totally focused on developing the technology. They always think about the consequences much later. That is usually for the politicians, policymakers, social scientists to say, hey, you're going to invent dynamite. Somebody is going to use it to blow up people, not just rocks. And the guy who invents it realizes it much later, and therefore spends his fortune trying to create a prize for peace after he's already created the means of destruction. So the technology people, how do they think about it? And before you answer, word to the audience, you know that you can write questions and send them to me. This is time. I'm sure there's been enough discussion already to provoke some thought and to get you to start thinking up some questions. So start sending them to me so that I can start looking at them and asking them as soon as George has given us his initial thoughts. Over to you.
Thank you, and grateful to be here. So the way I tend to look at the governance of emerging tech is I isolate three themes, so innovation, risks, and standards. That's kind of how I tend to look at these issues. Innovation drives risks, and risks require standards. And I think these themes can be used to kind of unpack why this is a uniquely complex policy area. And so I'll talk to innovation in the first instance. I probably won't go on to risks and standards right now, but I think it's worth acknowledging that around the globe, defense budgets are up, and the proportion of these defense budgets going into research and innovation is only increasing. And part of that will be on AI and autonomous weaponry. There are also new forms of organizations designed to support defense innovation. So the UK recently set up a UK Defence Innovation Organisation, attributed 400 million to support that. And so this is only going to drive the pace of change in the area. But it's also important to acknowledge that this is a dual use area. So civilian innovations in artificial intelligence and robotics will have crossover effects for military applications and vice versa. So if we think then of the scale of investment in robotics and AI, so what is sometimes called embodied robotics around the world, this presents an even greater sort of scale and scope of innovation. And I think, so one example, China is a leading player. It has a very developed industrial base in robotics. It's investing a lot in innovation. It's just set up a 138 billion venture fund, a strategic investment which includes embodied robotics. And they also have a doctrine of civil-military fusion, which means that they're prepared to connect commercial organizations to the military-industrial complex, which again drives new technologies. So I think what we will see is a lot of civil investments will have crossover effects and drive the AI capabilities and robotics developments, which then manifest on the battlefield. So I think any governance framework has to be able to be intelligent and networked into these wider kind of ecosystems of innovation in order to understand what the next frontier is, because I'm pretty sure that the drones we see today on the battlefield are not going to be the drones that we see in 6 months' time or a year or 2 years. So any governance or diplomatic multilateral event has to be cognizant of these wider innovation investments.
George, we've all mentioned the word drone a lot, but the drones are not going to be the only autonomous weapons system, presumably, that is going to be available. That's the starting point. And I think things are becoming more sophisticated. So what's out there that we should be aware of that in the world of innovation? Human beings are enormously capable of figuring out military use of technology long before they think through the civilian use. When the airplane was invented, before big commercial planes started flying across continents, military use of airplanes had already started. And so similarly, in this also, I think that the defense dimension of innovation is going to take priority over the non-defense. People will use AI to figure out how to win a war before they figure out how to use AI against cancer. I may be wrong, but as a historian, that's my understanding of human history and human nature. So what is out there other than drones that we should be aware of? Just a quick 1-minute list.
Well, I think what we briefly touched on last night, the idea of just pattern recognition in general is the key idea. So if you have a lot of data and a lot of stimuli, then AI is the tool by which you can make decisions on that stimuli. And I think that's the key issue, and that can be visual stimuli, it can be linguistic stimuli, but I think that to me is the crux of the matter. And so you're right, it's not just drones, it's just any relationship to data can be augmented and improved by artificial intelligence. And so if defense is a big apparatus of decision making with lots of hierarchies and lots of individuals and teams, there's really endless room potentially if the organization can adapt to that.
Yes, quickly.
Just a quick addition to your question, what we can expect. One thing that we already see is cyber attacks, where the artificial intelligence literally cuts exponentially the time of exploiting any vulnerability in a system, critical infrastructure or whatnot. The other one, that's what we are seeing. The other one is a conversion of the technologies, robotics, biotechnology, chemistry with AI, and where we can go with that. And that's again, double exponential curve, which we cannot even foresee what's going to happen in a few years. So we're going to come back to nuclear proliferation and biological weapons and chemical weapons with AI very, very soon.
So theoretically, the use of nuclear weapons could end up being data-driven rather than a human decision. The old image of the President of the United States having an assistant behind him carrying the so-called nuclear football over, there's some machine somewhere processing the data saying, okay, now the situation has come to the point where just launch. Call me old-fashioned, scary to me. Lots of questions. Let me start reading them, and then each one can pick up which question you want to answer. What is the Ambassador Navtej Sarna wants to know, what is the real-time analysis of use of autonomous weapons in Gaza? Any conclusions? Any forthcoming report? Anyone have anything to say on this? In Gaza. Yeah, a real-time analysis of use of autonomous weapons in Gaza. Is there any? And if so, is there a forthcoming report or are there any conclusions?
Just for those who are interested in the Gaza warfare, there are two Israeli researchers, a historian, a sociologist. One is Alon Sapir, the other one is Adam Raz, and they did some real-time analysis of the warfare in Gaza. They describe all the systems, the gospel system, which was used already in 2021 in the Operation Guardians of the Wall, then the Lavender system. This is for persons. The gospel is for buildings. And the conclusions are that these weapons, yes, they are used. You mentioned distinction, precaution, and proportionality, but not respecting these principles. Yeah, and that's why the need to control is much more urgent than we can imagine.
So AI needs to reform its ability to figure out proportionality and making a distinction.
If I may, just a practical experience. The system "Where is Daddy?" of the Israelis, identifying senior Hamas operatives. They have a ratio of 1 operative to 300 civilian casualties. A normal operative is 1 to 100 now, and this can be inserted into the AI system, and then the human giving the final go-ahead does not have any problem, because it's politically decided. One senior Hamas operative, 300 civilian casualties are tolerated, with the normal ones only 100, and this is something which really needs to be regulated.
In the end, it is a political decision. Yes, Laszlo.
Yeah, just to follow up on this to some extent, and also loop in the major topic of the Geneva Conventions. So when the conventions were drafted in 1949, and all the laws transpiring from that, the assumption was that human decision makers are operating on human time scale. That was the only possibility there. But as we already discussed it in different contexts, algorithmic warfare systems operate in milliseconds. And here comes the major issue, what Vladimir mentioned. Where do we put the humans? Where do humans fit into this picture? And this is becoming more and more difficult to answer. And I am very much concerned that since everything is becoming data-driven, putting the human beings, putting the humans as the decisive ones in this process is becoming almost impossible after some time. And we are talking about a constant development. We are talking about not only AI, but we are looking forward now to the AI, to the artificial general intelligence. When we will get there, can we get to a point when AI or artificial general intelligence reaches that point when they decide, they become autonomous, they decide that these human beings are just too slow for us. We just somehow overcome this problem. Shut us down or what? So,
okay. Yeah. So here's a question from Muhammad Al-Amiri. How can decision makers make decisions, and how can we ensure that human intervention always comes first rather than artificial intelligence? Or can that even happen? George, do you have an answer?
It's a very tough question around agency, but I think I would go back to Martin's point earlier around the legality of it. And I think if you're going to create standards around battle, around behavior and the nature of the technology and what it's doing, you need to be able to litigate those standards. And it's obviously will become quite messy if you can't distinguish where the agency lies in the decision-making system. But ultimately, you have to sue either an organization, an individual, or a team. You have to find and isolate that. And whether humans are in or on or out of the loop, as the terminology kind of dictates, it's really immaterial, because if I'm driving my car and the wheels fall off, I don't sue the car. I sue the company, the dealer, the mechanic, you have to find some culpability. And I just foresee that being incredibly complex and difficult in this context when AI possesses that autonomy in the system. So, no, I don't have an answer, but I foresee the legality being very, very difficult.
What I'm thinking, I'm coming back to what Ambassador Martins mentioned later before, was machine did it. This excuse, machine did it, and we already have it now in banks or wherever we move. When something is, I don't know, that the loan is decided, and the bank counter over there says, I don't know, the machine says you're not eligible for a loan. This is the problem, and I think it's A, the legal problem, but B, it's the mental educational problem. We have to understand that AI still is just a machine. It's an algorithm. Now, it's a very complex algorithm, which, when we come back to what Rashid mentioned, the implementation of the international law principles, humanitarian law like proportionality and so on, the way the machine, the algorithm does, we have software which we know what it does, but then we have the training on an amount of data which we don't know what results it's going to give out. So that's a major problem with AI technology, is our inability to explain how it decides. And that's intrinsic to the technology. We don't know. Similarly, I don't know, when I come back to your question at the beginning on the flag, white flag, the human, especially if it's not experienced person, is not going to be very sure whether it's a white flag and weapons dropped or not. Similarly, the AI is not going to be, maybe it's going to be more experienced because it had a database. But ultimately, coming back to a human, it's really whether we want to benefit from the speed of AI, being fully automated, whether in war or in business, because we want to earn more money or because we want to win a war. That's the benefit of AI, right? Or we want to come back to the values and responsibility as a human, not to say this is a machine and it decided. And the major battle, let's say in the GGE, in laws, is about the possible future convention or a binding mechanism. We have about 100 countries, more or less, in favor of a possible binding mechanism on the international level, which would not ban, but it would clearly set the boundaries of where humans have to be. As Secretary General said, at least deciding about death or life, at least that.
It would regulate that. I wonder if the Holocaust had been perpetrated through the help of AI, would we have had Nuremberg trials? And who would have been assigned the responsibility? The scientists who developed the AI, the people who fed the data? Secondly, AI is a great term, but in the end, all data is essentially generated by human beings in one form or another. So in the end, there is a human element already. The machine is not generating the data. The data is only being processed by the machine. Yes, Martin?
Well, if I may, I contradict a little bit. There are two problems with AI. This is the black box problem, where the machine itself and not a human is just doing something. One of the pioneers of the AI, Hili, or what's his name, he said, well, I do not know how it works, but it works. Now, if those who are working on the AI have themselves a problem that they do not know how it works, this is another topic which has to be put on the table, the so-called black box. And the second one is the bias problem. Get into the AI, give me the photo of an airline pilot. What do you get? You get a white male airline pilot. You do not get an Pakistani Airlines woman here. Now, in the Gaza context, we have exactly this. Elderly are excluded, those without smartphones are excluded, and the machine decides and not the human. So the bias cannot be, it's totally untransparent. Children excluded, elderly excluded, others are excluded.
I have more questions.
In the targeting here.
I have more questions from the audience. What will happen to the countries which are lacking the basic traditional infrastructure that the treaty would be, and what would the treaty be if the treaties become totally AI based? If all treaties are negotiated through AI and drafted through AI rather than human beings sitting and talking and negotiating, too far away, and hopefully not in our lifetimes because we'll all be out of a job, but possible. So what happens then? Rashid?
Yeah, I think, look, the UAE is going through that process right now. So we are working on using AI to help with legislation drafting. but we need to make sure that we use AI as an augmenter of what we do rather
tool.
than an autonomous thinker. And we have always sort of had those challenges from every single generation. It was similar when the internet sort of happened. How can we make sure of the data? How can we work towards making everything better? So there are ways that we can actually improve our decision making and embracing AI. So we shouldn't shy away from it.
Of course.
What we should do is make sure that, on a technical point of view, that we have, predictability, explainability. The thing that would really help us is making sure that we have secure logs. And this is where, there are a lot of protocols that we can put in place to make sure that there's no tampering, SHA codes, for example, making sure.
Put in place guardrails.
Exactly. And those guardrails need to make sure that there is a robust oversight and override systems that we can initiate. We can do a lot of red teaming, making sure we actually go through the whole process, make sure it's legit. And also, I think what's more important is having an international body that has real power, that goes into mandatory disclosures, compliance on those systems, making sure that whatever systems there are, is up to date. And at the end, also making sure that there are ethical AI standards. And I think when we come up with AI regulation or policy, you heard the panel earlier today, this changes not on, a yearly basis. This changes every single day.
Maybe every minute, depending on what's happening.
Exactly.
There.
And this is
Okay.
where we need to make sure that we have these ethical guidelines to make sure that no one oversteps them.
Good. Here's a very interesting question. In our apolar world, without a global policeman, how are the laudable initiatives that the distinguished speakers have discussed going to be enforced? Meaning, in the past, most treaties have been driven by some global power or the other. Somebody champions them, somebody pushes them. In a multipolar world in which nobody really has that kind of authority to get others and corral them towards a system, will it become more complicated, and will it take much longer to negotiate treaties, agreements, etc., including the regulation of AI? Yes, Rashid, you had something to say on that.
Well, moving on to the same point, right? Having a real mechanism for oversight. And what we can do is we can all agree. We agreed with chemical weapons; they're still used. We agreed with biological weapons; they're still used. And the scary thing with AI is how it can augment those weapons. Vladimir made a great point earlier. We can now make specific diseases to target specific DNA strands to make sure that they can, quote unquote, help with any genocide. You can actually make those serums or diseases and target them towards people. So it's very scary, and this is why we need international collaboration.
Yep, Vladimir, after that really blood-curdling little piece of information, what do you have to say?
No, it's more related to the question of how do we do it. And an example, we had negotiations on cybersecurity norms or responsible behavior of states in cyberspace for over 30 years almost. And we came up in the first committee of the UN with consensus agreement on global level that international law and international humanitarian law applies to cyberspace, same that we have for AI, but we don't know how to implement it. Then we have a set of cyber voluntary norms, and I emphasize voluntary. It's norms of behavior, which are disputed, like, can we do anything with norms in this world where the international law is being broken every day? And then a set of confidence-building measures and capacity building. What came out, and that's what we worked on this Geneva dialogue on responsible behavior, is that you have to unpack the roles of other stakeholders. And it's particularly important for algorithms. It's not just how they are implemented in the weapons. That piece of code or a database or a training is not going to be invented in UAE or in Geneva or even in Pentagon. It's going to be picking bits and pieces of code, open source here and there. It's a huge supply chain which drives in technical community, business community, civil society, you cannot implement it unless you have them on board. And we have documented in a Geneva dialogue on cybersecurity what are the roles of other stakeholders once the states agree to actually be able to implement together if we want. And I'm back to voluntary. I don't know whether we can implement the international law, both technically, whether we can control AI for proportionality and everything, but also human-wise, states are just breaking it. But if every one of us, and I mean other stakeholders, take it back, it's again back to that, we can't blame the machine, we have the responsibility, then there are ways. And we can learn from other processes, but I think this multi-stakeholder is very, very important.
The human experience has been that, those who have are always willing to make regulations for those who don't, but not for themselves. That was the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The 5 countries that already had the nuclear weapons, okay, guys, we will keep them, but everybody else, you can't make them. And after that, of course, 4 countries have since then acquired nuclear weapons, and maybe a 5th and 6th might emerge at some time. So once the genie is out of the box, it's always very difficult to put it back in. Laszlo, you wanted to say something. I noticed you.
Yes, actually, I will pick up on what you just said. Related to the MPT. I myself was involved in the review process for 4 years, chairing meetings in the review. And I always believe that this is really the process which will be able to keep control over the implementation of the treaty, etc. By now, I have to admit that I became much more skeptical, and the MPT is under enormous attack by itself. So if I extrapolate on this thought, I have to tell you that I am also skeptical about codification processes, whether we are able to figure out those kind of treaties which are going to solve problems. I'm afraid we are not. What we are really complied to do is more about creating general awareness of the problems. And here, many issues what we discussed come into the game, like the ethical issues that you just mentioned. If we are really able to focus on creating a huge network as global as possible for AI governance, establishing specialized institutions in different regions, wherever we can, geographically distributed expertise all around, while maintaining global coordination between them. Then the Gen Zs will be the ones who are, with this blessing what they have, they are breathing with AI. They are going to implement and they are going to act upon this kind of general awareness, which I think is more important today than any other codification processes. The codifications are going on, and just one more thought, in addition to the UN process, and that's very important. We already have the first internationally legally binding instrument on AI. It was created by the Council of Europe. This is the Framework Convention on AI and Human Rights, Democracy and Rule of Law. It was open for signature a year ago. And there are more and more countries signing it. Up to now, there are only just 17, but amongst them there are very key ones. And this is something what I think, as the first legally binding instrument, has to get more and more awareness about.
Well, the title of our conversation today, somebody came up with, Geneva versus algorithms, like, in a football match or something, so and so. So far, it seems to me from this conversation, the algorithms are winning and Geneva is way behind. George, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I think just picking up on that point about whether a formal multilateral mechanism is appropriate or whether the best we can hope for is to keep this front of mind, which I think is a really good point. And so a lot of my doctoral research was on science diplomacy, which is the role of scientists in diplomatic affairs. And a key example of this is in the nuclear domain, the issue of non-proliferation and the Pugwash conferences, where lots of physicists and nuclear experts convened to share technical details, to understand the issue, and to simply to bring it to the fore of global knowledge, global awareness. And you'd have eminent scientists, letter writing, engaging with the media, figures like Albert Einstein. And I think this would be desirable in this space, to have technical experts with profiles as part of a kind of transnational community saying exactly what is happening, why it's happening, what the technical detail is, and what the implications are. And I think so it may not be necessarily scientists, but AI experts. Problem is, in the AI field, the salaries are so high, most AI experts go and work for commercial organizations. So pulling them into a kind of transnational fora is a difficult one. Why is it in their interest to do it? Maybe it's just because they care about it. But so that's something I would think about looking for.
Enough of them don't seem to care, because it's really very difficult recruiting them for this purpose. Quick word, Martin, then I'm going to ask 2 more questions before I come back to you, Vladimir. So yes, Martin, quick word.
Yes, I would like...
Rashid, if you want to have a say on this.
You want
after Martin.
No, thank you very much for raising again the topic of this, Geneva versus algorithms. And you said algorithms are winning. I think there must be a multi-pronged process. The awareness, the education is one thing, and that you need to take the people with you. And the second one is the question of leadership. I do not see this leadership here. I see nice conferences like here, tabling it. I see expert meetings. And I see the Secretary General who has taken it up on his political agenda. But on the political level, I do not see a sense of urgency to tackle the problem. So back to Geneva, we have the Geneva Conventions, we have the first additional protocol on the protection of civilians, spelling out what you said, and let us be more practical and let us design politically. It must be a top-down and a bottom-up at the same time. Politically, a 4th additional protocol to have something concrete to bite on.
Sounds good, but the world is also in a bit of a political mess right now. Most of the countries, they have their own internal political debates, so it's going to be a tough one, but a good suggestion. Rashid.
Well, I was going to say, something similar, especially when it comes to education. We need to make sure that there is good upskilling for people within government jobs and international organizations to understand the sort of the crux of the matter, how things are done, so that the policy put in place is actually comprehensive enough to actually drive change.
Know what is happening before you can actually regulate it or make policy about it.
That's
fair
true.
enough. Okay, 2 quick questions that I'm going to read out. Then we'll have another round of open comments. But if there's any last questions, this is the time to submit them. Otherwise, you're forgotten. Okay, what about NLAWs, which this person says is non-lethal autonomous weapons, such as robo-riot control? Would that somehow, end up in violations of Geneva Conventions, of humanitarian law, of international law? And the second question is, so will artificial intelligence control everything related to wars? And if so, we end up truly depending on machines. What will our role be then? Just watching? So both these questions deserve some attention and some comments from each one of you. Free round, whoever raises their hand first gets to answer. George.
I think on the second question, it's optimistic. Military organizations are very, very large legacy organizations, which, whilst AI will be incorporated, it will take them a long time to change. Because they're so large and so old. So I think the idea that we're suddenly going to lurch into a period where AI has taken all decision-making authority away from the military structure, the hierarchy, I think that's not going to happen immediately. So I wouldn't. That was not a primary concern for me, I think.
Okay, and what about the non-lethal autonomous weapons such as robo-riot control? Anybody have a comment on that? Yes, Martin.
Yes, I think this is also discussed in the framework of what should be in this, let's say now, 4th additional protocol. The positive use, for example, defensive weapons and these non-lethal weapons used during riot control. Now, we have Iron Dome, for example. No human involved, because if there is an attack, I mean, you cannot have a human just checking 1 minute whether this rocket is coming or not. So you have within split seconds Iron Dome Patriot defensive systems, which of course have to be excluded from the human element. Otherwise, I mean, the rocket would hit your country. Now, and this has to be spelled out somewhere in a legal way. And the question of right control, the non-lethal autonomous weapons. There are many gray zones which have to be addressed, in particular the defensive and the non-lethal weapons. No, I stop here.
Okay, good. Yes, Vladimir?
Just a quick one on that. Generally, we have the agreement in the UN that the international law, international humanitarian law applies to cyberspace, applies to artificial intelligence in military domain. So I don't see a problem that it applies on anything which is non-lethal. That's absolutely clear. The question is, back to Rashid said, how? So what does it in practice means, and how can we clarify where proportionality is going to lead and distinction and so on? That leads me to the point that Ambassador Laszlo mentioned previously, is the awareness, or let's say these two pillars that you mentioned, leadership and awareness. And I think the lack of leadership, we see the interest of many states, including the big ones to some extent, to do something about this little part, but many of them are still towards economy and innovation. They're like, let's not touch anything, it's bringing money. But on the other hand, awareness is, in a broader community, is the one which can push for that leadership. Because we have stronger awareness, not only in Gen Z, but also in the tech sector, in open source community, in civil society, that pushes for leadership. The problem is the pace. And I think you started with that problem of the pace, where the society, and particularly diplomats, which move with a glacial pace, comparing to technology, that's a huge thing. But if we move the society, and especially Gen Z, which has an influence, and then the others to push for leadership, and we have military industry, which is still rather slow, we might have some chance. So I wouldn't discard Geneva as a possible winner, but it's really on us.
Well, the reason why diplomats move at a glacial pace is because diplomacy always involves looking at every aspect, every possibility, and finding solutions that satisfy the maximum. We may actually be moving towards a world where we may have to invent a new kind of diplomacy for Gen Z, which lives by the second and is not interested in getting into the depth of things in the same way as the older generations were. We have about 15 more minutes, so let us use them for a final round of final comments, mostly prescriptive, and I will start with George this time. What do you suggest? 3, 4, 5 points that you think needs to be done to ensure that the future of international humanitarian laws is somehow linked to the development of the technologies of the future, and that algorithms are actually something that do not autonomously cause war, conflict, but are subject to some humanitarian considerations that humanity has evolved over thousands of years.
I think a key issue for me is always expertise. So what expertise exists in diplomatic circles, and there's a great quote from Antony Blinken where he said a couple of years ago to the American Association for the Advancement of Science, I needed science and technology experts in the room just to tell me whether I needed science and technology experts in the room. And I think this alludes to a wider issue, which is how do you train a new cadre of diplomats to have the right skill set and the right expertise to deal with this challenge, and what that kind of hybrid skill set looks like. And what the diplomatic academy looks like to train them. And do they learn about ethics? Do they learn about computer science? Do they learn about robotics? What is that mix, and how do you put that together? And I think this issue, the capacity of diplomatic fora to move at the pace that is required, will require that hybridity and skill sets and those new forms of training. So if that were to take place, then I'd feel more optimistic about the capacity of Geneva to adapt to this challenge.
Vladimir, prescriptive future, where are we headed?
building on what George said, I can't agree more. So I think this new environment and the whole Hili Forum discussion showed that the environment, geopolitical environment is changing, so that diplomats will have to be much faster than before. Well, also the technology changes, and then the stakeholders which are in. So the whole environment is changing. So the training, the capacities of diplomats need to be advanced, and that's something that Diplo is particularly focused on. I typically like to see it as 3Ms. We always have these 4 Ts, 3Ms or whatever. It's a multidisciplinary, so that means they need to open the bonnet and see how AI works, not to details, but to understand how it works, how cyberspace works, but also legal, economical, political aspects. So multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder, they need to learn how to cooperate and discuss with big tech, small tech, open source community, NGOs and so on, and multi-level, as we discussed here, not just global, but also regional, ad hoc coalitions and so on. Not just diplomats. There are so many non-diplomats which are very influential in implementing the agreements. We need to train them as well, other stakeholders. And finally, embed the use of AI tools in that. And you mentioned it, they're not going to replace diplomats, but we need to teach diplomats to learn how to use AI every day. That's what we try to do with some sort of program we call AI apprenticeship for diplomats and others, through scenario exercises, through writing speeches with the use of AI, not by AI, right? And so on. I think this upscaling of capacities and skills is a must.
Rashid.
Yeah, I think there's a few things that should, hopefully will happen. Number one is sort of standard and norm setting. So we need to drive consensus on some aspect of human control. Make sure that there's traceability for the actions being done. And at least in the meantime, start with a quick win given the high uncertainty. So for example, banning high risk autonomy from day one and saying, look, we're going to work towards seeing how this could come into force later on, but right now it's not allowed.
Is there some kind of international, not consensus, but at least an international awareness on the need for banning complete?
I mean, you correctly identified the issue with NPTs before, right? The countries that already have the capabilities are more likely to come out and say, look, we want to ban those right now, so that they have that advantage.
We want to ban those who haven't got it
Correct.
yet, but we will keep it.
Correct. I think that's an issue. When what becomes really important is thinking about guidance and sort of soft laws. So can we come up with sort of model audit templates for current systems, and then making sure that we have transparency and oversight, including peer reviews. And holding, we always talk about the importance of strategic partnerships on an international level. Country, they're partners. This is a strategic partner for us. And sometimes you need this friend to say, look, this is, you're stepping a line here. And these conversations happen behind closed doors, and that's fine. But these are important. So, two things. There is also an element of non-violent warfare. And I think it's as reckless to forget about it. So I'm talking about, deep fakes, stirring, sectorial divides in countries, trying to, sort of battle from within. And I think that, again, using AI is a huge issue. We didn't touch upon, we don't have enough time. And one thing that I want to see kind of fully autonomized is wars. If we can fight wars in AI and we have a winner, and call it quits, keep civilians safe, I think that would be a great end goal for AI.
Great. Laszlo?
The UN is trying to do its best, and the member states are trying to do their best. Whether this is enough is a big question. Most recent developments, we are a little bit more advanced now, because just last month there was already an approval of the so-called global dialogue on AI governance, and by July next year there will be the first report. presented to that. Besides that, there was also a decision by the General Assembly to create a forum of 40 scientists. This is going to be a scientific panel, the best minds. The intention is to pull together the best minds, and the Secretary General is actually going to open the process for the nominations, where nations can, the member states can nominate their best scientists for this 40-member panel. So this process is going on, and it's very good, and it means that Geneva is trying to cope up. Not only Geneva, the whole UN system is trying to cope up with this challenge, and this is a very important new development, and it has to go on. This is very, very important to keep this movement on. Vladimir mentioned the special angle of diplomacy and AI. And that's very, very important, how diplomats can be helped by AI. They should be helped by AI. They must use AI. And I had the privilege of writing on this, which was published by the Hamburg Argus Diplomatic Academy. And I'm very grateful for that, also as well as for the invitation. This is something what I would say that diplomacy should be aware of all the possibilities. Now, how the AI can really facilitate their work. They cannot do it without this any longer. It's over. And the last point is going back a little bit to what I mentioned about the network to create global awareness and to create a kind of collective wisdom about both the dangers and the advantages of AI. This is crucial. I would say that in this regard, the Hili Forum itself is fulfilling something very important task, because that's what we are doing now. We are adding
just by discussing it, we are adding value.
Discussing it.
Good.
And you have to carry it with yourself. I am going to carry this with myself, for example, to the advisory body where I belong to. It's called Strategy International in Cyprus. This is something what you should do it on your own.
Perfect. I want to be the moderator who finishes the program exactly on time. So now you have 4 minutes.
Very good. So, 3 points. The first one, I was a little bit shocked by what you said about the bioengineering and so. And then I thought, well, it's not so bad at the end, because we have the contrary also. We have bioengineering to cure diseases which we were unable to be cured. So I would like to inject a little bit a positive spirit, because we were demonizing AI during the whole session. I would like to keep...
I don't think we were demonizing, Martin. We were just being critical.
Yes, okay. We were critical about the AI. So you mentioned who is the winner, Geneva or AI? Both should be the winners, I would say. And one has to incorporate, and this versus, I mean, maybe in the next Hili Forum, we try to find...
It needs a lot of hard work, basically. It needs a lot of integration. George pointed out one of the problems, people who are in the AI field, they make so much more money in the private sector that they are not devoting enough time and energy to this regulatory or governmental or political side of it. But it may be needed. That's one of the positives.
No, that's the first point. The second point is really a plea for this fourth additional protocol of Geneva Conventions to be practical, not to be stuck here in theoretical discussions. And this is relating to armed conflict. The Geneva Conventions are armed conflict, and now this not to be too late to really address this problem. Now, who is going to do it, with which elements? The substance was mentioned. Just to briefly summarize, there must be in this protocol a kind of principle of a meaningful human control of any weapon system. A ban on fully autonomous system, because then the human control is absent, and also a ban on the black box systems where it's uncontrollable what the outcome would be. Transparency and auditability must be elements of it. And then what was also mentioned, the review process. A review process which is in most of the agreements, but which is rarely implemented. The additional protocol number 1 has the Article 36. I mean, the review process is there, but nobody does it. It's national, it must be international. And last point is the process. I totally agree that the UN has to be in the driver's seat of this. Geneva, assisted by those like-minded Geneva institutions. We have the human rights, you mentioned it there, but also the ICRC, Swiss government. And being here in Abu Dhabi, I have the impression over the last day and a half here, this also could be a modern Switzerland, bringing people together and really being practical. Last word, not to forget the global south. We have spoken about Gen Z. We have spoken about the powerful states in the world, in an apolar world. I think those who have an interest is the global south to prevent detrimental developments in the AI field. 4 minutes over?
Actually 30 seconds to spare, which gives me the time to thank the audience. Thank you all very much. And to the participants. I think we had a robust discussion about a complex issue, touched on various aspects, and very frankly, each one of us is going home with something to think about. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you.